"That's a nice watch you've got there," the officer sneered, leaning against the park bench as if he had all the time in the world. The elderly man looked up, startled but composed, his hand instinctively moving to cover the family heirloom gleaming on his wrist. "It belonged to my father," the man said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with unease. The officer's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Instead, it carried the cold malice of someone who knew the weight of his authority and wielded it like a weapon. "Let me see it." The words were not a request. The man hesitated, looking around the park. There were families playing, joggers passing by, but no one seemed to notice the tension brewing on that quiet bench. His hand tightened protectively over the watch. "It's mine," he said, his voice firmer now. "I don't have to show you." The officer straightened, his jovial facade replaced with something far more dangerous. "Are you refusing to comply?" he said, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "I've done nothing wrong," the man replied, his shoulders squaring despite the odds stacked against him. "Is that so?" The officer's hand moved to his belt, fingers grazing his radio. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man with something to hide." The tension was palpable, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. The officer's hand darted forward, seizing the man's wrist with a force that belied the calm setting around them. The old man winced but didn't cry out, his dignity refusing to break under the weight of humiliation. "Let it go," the officer barked, pulling the watch free as if it were contraband. "Hey," the man protested, rising to his feet. "That's mine. You can't." The officer laughed, a hollow sound that echoed louder than the man's protest. "I'm the law here, old man. Maybe next time, you'll think twice about keeping something you can't prove belongs to you." He walked away, the watch dangling loosely from his hand, a trophy stolen under the guise of authority. The old man stood frozen, anger and disbelief warring on his face as he watched the officer disappear. But what the officer didn't know was that someone else was watching too. Someone who wouldn't let this injustice be buried like so many others. Behind the scenes, a son was preparing to fight a battle he never expected to face, against a system that underestimated just how far he'd go for justice. This was no ordinary son. His resolve was forged in the very courts where he wielded the law with precision and purpose. The man who had lost the watch was more than a victim, he was the foundation of everything his son believed in. As the days turned into weeks, the officer continued his life as if nothing had happened, confident that his badge would shield him from accountability. But the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. Whispers of his actions reached places he never anticipated. A well-placed question here, a quiet investigation there, and suddenly, the officer found himself at the center of scrutiny he couldn't shake. In the courtroom, where justice was supposed to reign, this son was no longer just a judge. He was a son seeking to right a wrong so blatant, so personal, it threatened to shatter the very ideals he stood for. How far could one man go to expose the ugly truths hidden beneath the surface of authority? The officer thought he'd silenced another voice. Instead, he'd awakened a storm. A storm fueled by years of unspoken pain, by a legacy that demanded justice not just for one man but for everyone who'd ever been silenced by power misused. Would the officer face the consequences of his actions? Could a system often complicit in its silence finally hold one of its own accountable? And most importantly, how would this son, a man who believed in the rule of law above all, ensure that justice was served without losing himself in the process? Stay with us to uncover the truth behind the stolen watch and the extraordinary lengths a son will go to honor his father's dignity. Because sometimes, justice isn't just served, it's demanded. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This story you're about to hear highlights the resilience and strength of those who stand for justice in the face of prejudice. To our Black audience members, you matter, your experiences matter, and we're here to amplify stories that bring change and awareness. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more narratives that inspire and challenge perspectives. Let's dive in. The morning sunlight filtered through the leaves of the oak trees scattered across the park, casting dappled patterns on the pavement. It was a peaceful, unassuming corner of the city, a place where people walked their dogs, jogged before work, or simply sat on benches to reflect. This was the favorite spot of Walter Green, a retired teacher whose presence in the neighborhood was as enduring as the trees themselves. Walter, a man in his late 70s, carried himself with quiet dignity, his neatly pressed clothes and polished shoes reflecting the discipline he had imparted to his students for decades. His most prized possession, however, was a gold pocket watch that glinted softly on his wrist, an heirloom passed down from his father, a man who had survived an era of oppression to provide his family with a better life. Walter cherished the watch not for its material value but for what it symbolized: resilience, hope, and a connection to his roots. Every morning, as he sat on the same bench, he would glance at the watch, running his fingers over its smooth surface as if drawing strength from its history. He loved the park, not just for its tranquility but for the sense of community it offered. Walter often exchanged polite greetings with joggers or chatted with parents who passed by with strollers. It was a space that felt safe, a respite from a world that had not always been kind. On the other side of town, Derek Harris was starting his day very differently. As a police officer, Derek wore his uniform like armor, a shield he used to assert his authority. At 35, he had spent over a decade in the force, rising through the ranks not because of exemplary service but through calculated alliances and a willingness to look the other way when it served him. Derek's view of the world was shaped by his own insecurities, his need to dominate masking a deep-seated fear of inadequacy. He saw himself as a protector, but his actions often contradicted that belief. Derek had a knack for finding trouble, or creating it. His badge gave him a sense of power, a license to act without consequence, or so he thought. Derek's day began with a routine patrol that often involved harassing those he deemed out of place. He wasn't the type to reflect on the broader implications of his behavior. To him, it was simple: assert control, maintain order. The park was one of his usual haunts, a place where he could enforce his authority on unsuspecting individuals. Derek wasn't looking for criminals, he was looking for an outlet, someone who couldn't push back. That day, as Walter sat on his bench, adjusting the watch on his wrist, Derek's patrol car slowed to a stop nearby. From his window, Derek spotted the gleam of gold against Walter's dark skin. His lips curled into a smirk. For Derek, the sight of an elderly black man wearing what appeared to be an expensive watch wasn't just unusual, it was an opportunity. Walter didn't notice Derek approach at first. He was absorbed in his thoughts, thinking about the family dinner he had planned for the evening. His son, Marcus, would be there, a rare occurrence given Marcus's demanding schedule as a judge. Marcus was the pride of Walter's life, a man who had risen through the challenges of systemic bias to sit on the bench of the city's superior court. Walter often joked that Marcus had inherited his stubbornness and his sense of justice, qualities that had served him well in his career. Morning, Derek's voice cut through Walter's thoughts. He looked up to see the officer standing over him, his hands on his hips and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Walter nodded politely. "Good morning, officer." "Nice day to be out," Derek continued, his tone casual, but his gaze fixed on the watch. "That's a fine piece you've got there. Mind if I take a look?" Walter frowned, his hand instinctively covering the watch. "It's a family heirloom," he said simply. "It's been with me for years." Derek's smile hardened. "I didn't ask about its history. I asked to see it." Walter shifted uncomfortably. "I'd prefer not to, officer. It's quite personal." Derek took a step closer, his shadow falling over Walter. "Personal, huh? Well, you see, I have a duty to investigate anything that looks suspicious. And that watch," he pointed, "looks a little out of place." Walter felt a rush of indignation. "I'm not sure what you're implying, officer, but I assure you, I've done nothing wrong." Derek's expression darkened. "Is that right? Because I don't think you understand how this works. I ask, you comply. Now, hand it over. Walter stood, his frame straight and his voice steady. I'm not giving you my watch. Derek's hand shot out, gripping Walter's wrist with a force that made the older man wince. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, old man. I can take it as evidence if I want. Evidence of what? Walter demanded, his voice rising. Walking in the park while black. A few heads turned, but no one intervened. Derek's grip tightened as he yanked the watch free. Walter staggered back, clutching his wrist as Derek held the watch aloft like a trophy. Consider it confiscated, Derek said coldly before turning and walking away, leaving Walter stunned and humiliated. That evening, Marcus arrived at Walter's house for dinner, finding his father unusually quiet. The old man sat at the kitchen table, staring at his wrist where the watch had once been. Marcus pressed him for answers, and though Walter tried to downplay the incident, Marcus's sharp instincts picked up on the pain behind his father's words. Who was it, Dad? Marcus asked, his voice low but firm. Walter hesitated before describing the officer, the park, and the theft. Marcus's hands curled into fists as he listened. He had spent years fighting for justice, holding people accountable, and now, someone had dared to humiliate his own father. Don't worry about it, son, Walter said, sensing the storm brewing in Marcus's eyes. It's just a watch. It's not just a watch, Marcus replied. It's your dignity. And no one has the right to take that from you. As Marcus left that night, his mind was already racing. He couldn't let this go. Not for his father. Not for the countless others who had likely faced similar injustices. He knew he had the tools, the knowledge, and the power to make a difference. But how far was he willing to go? The stage was set. On one side, a man who believed his authority made him untouchable. On the other, a son determined to prove that no one, not even a man with a badge, was above accountability. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and neither Derek nor Walter could predict the storm that was about to unfold. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, his usually orderly desk cluttered with files. His mind churned, replaying his father's account of the previous day's events. He couldn't shake the image of his father, a proud and dignified man, sitting at the kitchen table with a hollow look in his eyes. It wasn't just about the watch, it was about the principle, the blatant misuse of authority. Marcus had built his career on the foundations of fairness and justice, but this was personal. Janet, Marcus called, leaning toward the intercom on his desk. His assistant's voice buzzed through the speaker. Yes, Judge Green. Can you get me everything we have on Officer Derek Harris? Any complaints, incidents, anything unusual in his record? There was a pause before she replied, her tone cautious. Of course, but, is this about something specific? Let's just call it a personal inquiry, Marcus said, his voice measured but firm. Janet didn't press further, she knew Marcus was not one to act on impulse. By the time the lunch hour approached, Marcus had a slim but revealing folder on his desk. Inside were details of Derek Harris's 10-year career, a career marked by a troubling pattern of excessive force allegations, racially charged complaints, and disciplinary warnings that never seemed to go anywhere. The officer's connections within the department had shielded him, burying his misdeeds under layers of bureaucracy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the tension in his jaw tightening with every page he read. Derek wasn't just a bad cop, he was a symptom of a larger problem, a system that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. His fingers drummed on the desk as his thoughts raced. This wasn't just about his father anymore. That evening, Marcus returned to his father's house. Walter was in the garden, tending to his plants with the same patience he had shown in the classroom for decades. When Marcus approached, Walter didn't look up, but his voice carried a gentle admonition. You shouldn't let this eat at you, Marcus. It's not worth it. It is worth it, Dad, Marcus replied, crouching beside him. You taught me to stand up for what's right. How can I do anything else? Walter sighed, placing a small trowel on the ground. What's right doesn't always come easily. And sometimes, it's better to let things go. Marcus shook his head. Not this time. I've seen his record, Dad. He's hurt people before. He'll hurt others if no one stops him. Walter studied his son for a long moment, his eyes filled with both pride and worry. And what will you do? Fight the whole system? If I have to, Marcus said firmly. The days that followed were a flurry of quiet but determined action. Marcus began contacting people he trusted, reporters, community leaders, even a few officers he knew from years of working alongside law enforcement. Each conversation was carefully crafted, designed to gather information without revealing too much. One evening, Marcus sat across from Clara Ramirez, an investigative journalist known for her fearless exposés. They met at a quiet coffee shop, away from prying eyes. This isn't just about one bad cop, Marcus said, sliding the folder across the table. It's about a system that protects him. Clara flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing as she read. This is heavy stuff, she said, glancing up. But you know as well as I do that going after him means going after the department. They won't take this lightly. I'm counting on it, Marcus replied. He needs to be held accountable, and the people protecting him need to know they can't get away with it. Clara leaned back, considering his words. You're putting yourself in the crosshairs, Judge. This could get ugly. I'm not afraid of ugly, Marcus said, his tone resolute. Meanwhile, Derek carried on as though nothing had happened. His confidence, bolstered by years of getting away with misconduct, left him blind to the storm brewing around him. But small cracks were beginning to form. A routine inquiry from Internal Affairs had caught him off guard, and whispers among his colleagues hinted at something bigger. One afternoon, Derek sat in the locker room, lacing up his boots when another officer, a rookie named Tom, approached hesitantly. Hey, Harris, Tom began, his voice uncertain. You hear about the judge looking into some old cases? Derek froze for a moment before scoffing. Judges look into things all the time. Nothing to worry about. Yeah, but, Tom hesitated. Word is, it's your cases he's asking about. Derek's smirk faltered. He stood abruptly, towering over the younger officer. You believe everything you hear, kid? Stick to your patrols and leave the big stuff to people who know what they're doing. Tom nodded quickly, retreating, but Derek's mind was racing. He thought back to the old man in the park and the watch. Could this be connected? That evening, Derek sat alone in his apartment, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. He stared at the watch, its gold face catching the dim light. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Had he gone too far? But the thought was quickly replaced by anger. Who did this judge think he was, digging into Derek's life? Elsewhere, Marcus was meeting with a group of community leaders, presenting his findings and rallying support. One of the attendees, an elderly pastor, spoke up after Marcus finished. You're doing God's work, son, the pastor said. But you need to be careful. People in power don't like being exposed. I understand the risks, Marcus replied. But this isn't just about my father. It's about every person who's been silenced or ignored. We can't let fear stop us. As the meeting broke up, Clara approached Marcus, her expression serious. I've got some leads on other victims, she said. People who've been harassed or worse by Harris. If we can get them to talk, it'll strengthen the case. Marcus nodded. Do it. The more voices, the harder it'll be for them to deny the truth. The groundwork was laid, but the tension was building. Marcus knew that confronting Derek directly would be inevitable. He was prepared to face whatever came, but even he couldn't predict the chain of events that would soon unfold. Derek, growing increasingly paranoid, began making mistakes. A routine traffic stop turned into a heated argument when he overreacted to a driver questioning his authority. The incident was caught on video, and though it didn't directly connect to Marcus's investigation, it added fuel to the fire. By the end of the week, Derek was summoned to his precinct for a meeting with his superiors. As he sat in the sterile conference room, the door opened, and to his surprise, Marcus walked in, accompanied by an internal affairs officer. Derek's smug demeanor wavered as he realized that whatever was happening was bigger than he'd anticipated. But this wasn't the end, just the beginning of a reckoning. Marcus had set the stage for a confrontation that would force everyone to face the truth. And as Derek stared across the table at Marcus, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. The question lingered in the air: when justice is personal, how far will someone go to see it served? The precinct conference room was colder than usual, its stark white walls and fluorescent lighting amplifying the tension in the air. Derek Harris sat at the head of the long table, flanked by his attorney, a man whose confidence seemed to evaporate with every second of silence. Across from him sat Marcus Green, calm but with a steel edge in his eyes that made the officer shift uncomfortably in his seat. The internal affairs investigator, a middle-aged man named Clark with a meticulous reputation, shuffled through a stack of files before glancing up at Derek. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. "Officer Harris, you're here today because of a pattern of allegations and complaints that have come to our attention. Excessive force, misconduct, and, most recently, a claim involving a theft during an unauthorized search." Derek smirked, though his fingers tapped nervously against the table. "A claim? That's all it is. People make claims about cops every day. Doesn't make them true." Marcus leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "And does a claim always come with evidence, Officer Harris?" Derek's smirk faltered. His attorney interjected, raising a hand. "We're not here to entertain baseless accusations. If there's evidence, let's see it." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened a folder in front of him and carefully placed a photograph on the table. It was a close-up of the watch, the gold glinting under soft lighting. The attorney stiffened, and Derek's eyes flickered toward it before quickly darting away. "That's a nice watch," Marcus said, his tone deceptively casual. "A family heirloom, passed down for generations. Taken from my father." Derek's fingers stopped tapping. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't?" Marcus replied, raising an eyebrow. He slid another photograph forward. This one showed Derek at a bar, laughing with a group of friends. On his wrist, unmistakable, was the same gold watch. "That's not," Derek began, but Marcus cut him off. "Don't lie. We both know what this is." Marcus's voice rose slightly, the calm giving way to controlled anger. "You took it from him. You humiliated a man who has more dignity in his pinky than you've shown in your entire career." Clark cleared his throat, interjecting. "Officer Harris, do you deny this watch was taken during an encounter with Mr. Walter Green?" Derek's attorney leaned in, whispering furiously, but Derek shoved him back. "I didn't take it. He must have dropped it, and I..." "Enough," Marcus snapped, his tone icy. "Stop insulting my father's intelligence, and mine. You didn't take that watch by mistake. You took it because you thought you could. Because you think a badge gives you the right to take what you want from people who can't fight back." The silence that followed was suffocating. Derek's eyes darted to Clark, then to Marcus, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the evidence and the judge's unrelenting stare. Clark spoke again, his tone firm. "Officer Harris, given the evidence presented and your failure to provide a satisfactory explanation, we will be recommending suspension pending further investigation." Derek's jaw tightened, his pride stinging more than the impending punishment. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Suspension?" Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his voice laced with disbelief. "This isn't just about a watch. It's about a pattern. A man like him doesn't deserve a badge. Clark hesitated. Judge Green, we are following protocol. Further disciplinary action will be considered based on what? Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. On how much more damage he can do before you act. Derek slammed a hand on the table, rising to his feet. You don't know anything about me, Judge. You sit up there in your robe, passing judgment like you're better than everyone else. Marcus stood too, meeting Derek's glare without flinching. This isn't about being better. It's about accountability. Something you clearly don't understand. The room crackled with tension as the two men stared each other down. Finally, Clark intervened, his voice sharp. That's enough. Officer Harris, you're dismissed. Further proceedings will be communicated to you in writing. Derek stormed out, his attorney trailing behind him. Marcus stayed behind, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He had gotten the first step of what he wanted, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Later that night, Marcus met Clara Ramirez at a small cafe downtown. She slid a folder across the table, her expression serious. More victims, she said quietly. Interviews, statements, even a few video clips. It's damning. Marcus flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each page. He's done this to so many people, he murmured. How has he gotten away with it for this long? Clara shrugged. Connections. Silence. Fear. But that's about to change. Marcus nodded. It has to. As the night wore on, Marcus's plan began to take shape. The internal investigation was a start, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He needed to shine a light on Derek's actions, to expose not just him but the system that had protected him for so long. And he knew just how to do it. The next morning, Walter Green sat in his living room, watching the morning news. His breath caught when he saw Marcus on the screen, standing at a podium with Clara by his side. This is about more than one man, Marcus said, his voice steady but impassioned. This is about a system that allows abuse to go unchecked, that values power over accountability. My father was a victim, but he won't be the last unless we demand change. Walter's eyes filled with tears as he watched his son speak, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. At the precinct, Derek watched the same broadcast, his fists clenched. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. But he wasn't going down without a fight. As the days unfolded, the tension reached a breaking point. Protests erupted outside the precinct, calling for Derek's termination and broader reforms. Inside, Derek faced mounting pressure from his superiors and colleagues, many of whom were beginning to distance themselves from him. Marcus, meanwhile, prepared for the final confrontation. He had the evidence, the support, and the determination to see this through. All that remained was to ensure that justice was not only served but seen. The stage was set, and the lines were drawn. In the battle for accountability, only one side could prevail. And as the city watched, holding its collective breath, the question lingered, would the system finally bend to the weight of truth? Or would it once again shield those who abused its power? The courthouse was silent except for the faint rustling of papers and the soft murmur of spectators. The case had drawn significant attention, with reporters filling the gallery and community leaders seated prominently to show their support. At the center of it all stood Derek Harris, his usual bravado replaced by a tense, guarded demeanor. He adjusted his tie, glancing nervously at the judge presiding over the case, Marcus Green. The room buzzed with an air of anticipation, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on everyone present. Marcus's gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the murmur subsided. His voice was calm but carried the authority of someone determined to see justice served. This court is now in session, Marcus announced. We are here to review allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority by Officer Derek Harris. Derek's attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary expression, stood. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. The allegations against him are based on hearsay and assumptions. There is no concrete evidence tying him to the incidents in question. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. We'll see about that. Clara Ramirez, seated at the plaintiff's table, rose next. She was poised, her tone unwavering as she spoke. Your Honor, the evidence we have compiled speaks for itself. Video recordings, eyewitness accounts, and testimony from multiple victims paint a clear picture of a pattern of abuse. She turned, gesturing toward the gallery. With the court's permission, I would like to call the first witness. Marcus nodded. Proceed. A man in his late 20s approached the stand, his steps hesitant but determined. He was introduced as Jerome Collins, a former construction worker who had filed a complaint against Derek 3 years earlier. As Jerome settled into the witness chair, Clara began her questioning. Mr. Collins, can you describe your encounter with Officer Harris? Jerome's voice was steady, though it trembled slightly with emotion. I was on my way home from work, covered in dust from the site. He pulled me over, said my taillight was out, even though I knew it wasn't. Before I knew it, he had me out of the car, handcuffed on the side of the road. When I asked what I'd done wrong, he told me to stay in my place. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clara leaned in. And did Officer Harris confiscate anything from you during this encounter? Jerome nodded. My wallet. Said it was evidence. I never got it back. Derek's attorney stood. Objection. This is anecdotal and unverified. Clara turned to Marcus, her eyes sharp. Your Honor, we have records showing Officer Harris logged a wallet as evidence that day but never filed it with the department. Marcus nodded. The objection is overruled. Continue. As the questioning went on, more witnesses came forward, each story a thread weaving a tapestry of Derek's misconduct. A single mother who had been harassed during a routine traffic stop. An elderly man whose belongings were searched without cause. A teenager who had been detained for hours without explanation. Their voices, trembling but resolute, filled the room, each testimony adding weight to the case against Derek. Derek sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of indifference, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his discomfort. When it was his turn to take the stand, his attorney advised against it, but Derek insisted. He wasn't going to sit silently while his career unraveled before him. As Derek settled into the witness chair, Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Officer Harris, do you understand the severity of the allegations against you? I do, Derek replied, his voice clipped. But I maintain that I've done nothing wrong. I've served this city for 10 years, and this is how I'm repaid. Marcus's expression remained impassive. Serving the city doesn't grant you immunity from accountability. Let's discuss the most recent incident involving Walter Green. Derek shifted uncomfortably. That was blown out of proportion. I didn't take anything from him. Clara stood, holding up a photograph. It was a still from the surveillance footage at the bar, clearly showing Derek with the watch on his wrist. Then how do you explain this? She asked. Derek's attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. This evidence was obtained without proper warrants. Marcus raised a hand. Overruled. The photo is admissible. Derek's confidence wavered. I found it, he stammered. On the ground in the park. I didn't know it was his. Clara's tone sharpened. You expect this court to believe that you found a family heirloom and decided to wear it as your own? The gallery murmured again, and Marcus rapped his gavel for silence. Derek's facade was crumbling, and he knew it. Beads of sweat formed on his brow as Clara continued to press him. You didn't find it, Officer Harris. You took it. You took it because you thought no one would challenge you. But now you're being challenged, and the truth is coming out. Derek's voice rose, defensive. This is a witch hunt. You're all out to get me because I wear this badge. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but forceful. No one is out to get you, Officer Harris. This is about your actions, not your badge. And actions have consequences. The room fell silent as Marcus's words hung in the air. Derek slumped back in his chair, his confidence shattered. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. As the day drew to a close, Marcus addressed the court. This case is about more than one officer. It's about a system that allows misconduct to persist. Officer Harris's actions have not only violated the trust of this community but have also tarnished the reputation of the department he represents. This court will deliberate and render a decision. The gavel came down, signaling a temporary adjournment. The gallery buzzed with quiet conversations as people began to leave. Walter, sitting in the front row, looked at his son with a mixture of pride and relief. "You've done good, Marcus," Walter said quietly. "No matter what happens, you've made a difference." Marcus nodded, his resolve firm. "It's not over yet, Dad. But we're getting there." As the courtroom emptied, Derek remained seated, his head bowed. For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone facing the weight of his actions. Marcus watched him for a moment before turning away, the faintest glimmer of justice beginning to shine through the cracks of a broken system. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus sat alone at the judge's bench, his fingers lightly tapping the wood. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him like a physical force. He had seen justice served many times before, but this was different. This wasn't just another case, it was personal, a rare collision of his professional duty and his deepest moral convictions. Walter approached cautiously, standing at the edge of the bench. He hesitated before speaking, his voice soft. "Marcus, you've done enough. You've made your point." Marcus looked up at his father, exhaustion etched on his face. "Have I? Or have I just scratched the surface?" "You can't fix everything," Walter said gently, though his voice carried a note of concern. "Sometimes, you have to let go." "I can't let go of this, Dad," Marcus replied firmly. "Not when people like Derek Harris continue to wear a badge and call it justice." Walter sighed, sitting down in the front row of the empty courtroom. "Justice doesn't always look the way we want it to. You've shown people the truth. That matters." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with the implications of the trial. The evidence was damning, the testimonies undeniable, but Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. The legal system didn't always operate on morality, it was a labyrinth of procedures, politics, and compromises. Derek might face consequences, but would they be enough to dismantle the broader culture that had allowed him to thrive? Later that evening, Marcus found himself in his office, staring at the city lights through the window. Clara sat across from him, her laptop open as she reviewed notes for her next article. "You're not satisfied," Clara observed, her tone neutral but probing. Marcus didn't turn around. "How can I be? Harris is just one man. He's a symptom, not the disease." Clara closed her laptop and leaned forward. "So what's next? You've exposed him. You've got the community on your side. What else are you looking for?" "I want accountability," Marcus said, turning to face her. "Not just for him, but for everyone who let him get away with it. The officers who covered for him. The department heads who ignored complaints. They're complicit." Clara frowned, considering his words. "That's a bigger fight. One that might not end the way you want." "I know," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But someone has to start it." Meanwhile, Derek sat in his apartment, the walls closing in around him. The usually tidy space was now littered with empty beer bottles and crumpled papers. He had spent hours poring over his options, his attorney's words echoing in his mind, "We can fight this, but you need to be careful about what you say moving forward." Derek's anger simmered just below the surface. He had always believed in his ability to manipulate situations, to outlast his critics. But now, with the public outcry and the mountain of evidence against him, even he could see the walls of his fabricated invincibility beginning to crumble. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a message from a fellow officer flashing across the screen: "We're distancing ourselves. Don't bring us down with you." The betrayal stung more than Derek expected. He had always thought of the precinct as a brotherhood, but now it was clear that loyalty only extended as far as convenience. He hurled the phone across the room, the screen shattering against the wall. At the same time, protests continued to grow outside the courthouse and police precinct. The community, galvanized by Marcus's unwavering pursuit of justice, demanded systemic change. Signs reading, "Accountability now," and "No more badges without honor," filled the streets. Local news outlets covered the demonstrations, and the pressure on city officials mounted. In a closed-door meeting, the police chief and the district attorney discussed their next steps. The chief, a pragmatic man nearing retirement, rubbed his temples as he reviewed the growing list of complaints against Derek. "He's a liability," the chief admitted. "But if we throw him to the wolves, what message does that send to the rest of the department?" The district attorney leaned back in his chair, his expression calculating. "It sends the message that we don't tolerate corruption. It also opens the door to more scrutiny," the chief countered. "If Harris goes down, who's next?" "That's the cost of doing the right thing," the district attorney said firmly. "The question is, are we ready to pay it?" Back at home, Walter watched the news coverage, his heart heavy. He admired his son's resolve, but he worried about the toll it was taking on him. Marcus had always been a fighter, even as a child, standing up to bullies and questioning authority when it seemed unjust. Walter had raised him to value integrity, but he wondered if he had also burdened him with an impossible standard. When Marcus arrived at Walter's house later that night, his father greeted him with a warm meal and a quiet smile. They sat in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware filling the void between them. "You know," Walter began, breaking the silence, "when I gave you that watch, I didn't just want you to remember your grandfather. I wanted you to remember where you came from. The struggles we've faced. The resilience we've shown." "I do, Dad," Marcus said softly. "That's why I can't let this go." Walter reached across the table, placing a hand on Marcus's. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in this fight. Justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about how you live your life." Marcus nodded, the weight of his father's words settling over him. "I won't lose myself. But I have to see this through." The next day, Marcus stood in front of the courthouse steps, addressing a crowd of reporters and supporters. His voice was steady, but his words carried the fire of someone who refused to back down. "This isn't the end," he said. "This is the beginning. The truth has come to light, but now we must ensure that it leads to real change. Not just for my father, but for every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or ignored." Inside the courthouse, Derek sat with his attorney, his confidence eroded to a shell of its former self. He knew the verdict was coming, and for the first time, he felt the weight of consequences he had always believed himself immune to. As the court reconvened, Marcus took his seat at the bench, his gaze unwavering. The gallery was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The jury filed in, their expressions solemn as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Derek clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He had played the system for years, but now, with the eyes of the city on him, he knew there was no escape. The walls were closing in, and all he could do was wait for the inevitable. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood, a folded piece of paper trembling slightly in his hands. All eyes were on him, but none more piercing than Derek Harris's. His face betrayed no emotion, but his clenched fists resting on the table told a different story. Across the room, Marcus Green watched from his bench, his expression calm but his mind racing. This moment wasn't just about the verdict, it was about what it represented for his father, for the community, and for a justice system that often failed to deliver on its promises. The foreman cleared his throat, breaking the silence. In the matter of misconduct and abuse of power by Officer Derek Harris, we find the defendant. Time seemed to slow as the foreman read the verdict. The words, "guilty on all counts," echoed through the courtroom, and a collective breath was released from the gallery. Some spectators whispered prayers of gratitude, others exchanged glances of relief. Derek, however, remained seated, his jaw tightening as the weight of the decision settled on him. Marcus tapped his gavel once, his voice steady as he spoke. "The jury has reached its decision. Officer Derek Harris is hereby convicted on multiple counts of misconduct and abuse of authority. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date." Derek's attorney leaned over, whispering furiously, but Derek didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his mind far from the chaotic whispers of the courtroom. Marcus took a moment to survey the room, his eyes resting briefly on his father, Walter, who was seated in the front row. Walter's expression was calm, though his hands were clasped tightly together. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, Marcus saw both pride and a quiet sadness. This wasn't just a victory, it was a reminder of how much had been lost along the way. As the courtroom emptied, Derek was escorted out by officers. The once confident cop looked smaller now, as if the verdict had stripped him of the authority he had wielded so carelessly. The gallery buzzed with muted conversations, but Walter stayed seated, watching as his son gathered his papers and prepared to leave the bench. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were packed with protesters and reporters. The news of Derek's conviction had spread quickly, and the crowd was electric with emotion. Some carried signs reading, "Justice at last," while others chanted for broader reforms. Clara Ramirez stood near the edge of the crowd, her notebook in hand, jotting down observations for her next article. She spotted Marcus exiting the courthouse and pushed through the throng to reach him. "Judge Green," Clara called, catching his attention. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus stopped, adjusting his briefcase. "Clara. I'm guessing you have questions." "Just one," she said, her tone serious. "What does this mean for the bigger picture? Derek Harris is one officer, but you've made it clear that this case is about more than just him." Marcus exhaled, glancing back at the courthouse steps before responding. "This is a step in the right direction, but it's far from enough. There are systems in place that allowed him to act the way he did for years without accountability. If we stop here, nothing changes." Clara nodded, scribbling furiously. "And what's next? Will you push for further investigations?" "I'll do everything in my power to ensure this isn't just a single case," Marcus replied. "But real change will require more than one judge. It needs community action, policy reform, and people willing to hold the system accountable." Clara studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. "Thank you for your time, Judge. And for what you've done." Marcus shook her hand, then turned toward the waiting car where Walter was already seated. As he slid into the driver's seat, his father broke the silence. "You've done good, Marcus," Walter said softly. "But you're carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders." "It's not just my fight, Dad," Marcus replied, starting the car. "It's ours. All of us." Walter nodded, though his expression remained pensive. "Just make sure you don't lose yourself in it. The fight for justice is important, but so is knowing when to rest." Later that evening, Derek sat in a holding cell, his head in his hands. The sterile walls around him felt like they were closing in, a stark contrast to the life he had led just weeks ago. The badge that had once made him feel invincible now seemed like a distant memory. He thought about the courtroom, about Marcus Green's unwavering gaze, and about the voices of the victims who had testified against him. For the first time, Derek felt a pang of something unfamiliar, regret. The door to the holding area opened, and Derek's attorney stepped inside. He sat across from Derek, placing a folder on the table between them. "They'll be scheduling sentencing soon," the attorney said, his tone brisk. We need to prepare a statement. Show remorse, take responsibility, it might help with leniency. Derek scoffed, leaning back in his chair. And what good will that do? They've already made up their minds. Because it's the only option you have left, the attorney snapped. This isn't about getting off easy, it's about damage control. The sooner you accept that, the better. Derek didn't respond. He stared at the wall, his mind replaying the events that had led him to this point. The watch. The accusations. The trial. His arrogance had shielded him for so long, but now, stripped of his badge and his reputation, he was forced to confront the reality he had tried so hard to ignore. Meanwhile, at Walter's house, the Green family gathered for a quiet dinner. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks, though a lingering tension remained. As Marcus recounted the day's events, his younger sister, Lisa, spoke up. "You did the right thing, Marcus," she said. "But does it ever feel like it's not enough?" Marcus paused, setting down his fork. "Sometimes. But it's a start." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe this will be a wake-up call for the people who protect guys like Harris. Maybe they'll think twice next time." Walter, who had been silent for most of the meal, finally spoke. "Change doesn't come easy. But what you've done, Marcus, it's planted a seed. And seeds can grow into something much bigger." As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself reflecting on his father's words. The trial was over, but the fight was far from finished. He knew there would be more battles ahead, against individuals like Derek Harris, against systems that perpetuated injustice, and even against his own doubts. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the truth had been brought to light and that, at least for today, justice had prevailed. The sentencing day arrived with the same intensity that had marked every step of the trial. The courtroom was packed once more, but this time, the air was different. The weight of what had transpired loomed heavily, yet there was a collective sense of resolution. Derek Harris was brought in, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a subdued and introspective presence. His uniform, his badge, his authority, everything he had used to define himself, was gone. Marcus Green took his place at the bench, his gaze steady as he prepared to deliver the final judgment. He had spent the past days reflecting on the gravity of his decision. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability and the possibility of redemption, however faint that might seem. Derek Harris needed to face the consequences, but more importantly, the system needed to learn from his actions. As Derek rose to face the court, his attorney spoke on his behalf, urging leniency and citing the officer's years of service. But when Marcus gave Derek the opportunity to speak, the room fell silent. Derek hesitated before beginning, his voice quiet but clear. "I won't stand here and pretend I didn't do wrong. I've hurt people, and I can't undo that. I used my badge as a weapon, and I betrayed the trust that comes with it. To Mr. Green and to everyone else I wronged, I'm sorry. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can promise to live differently from now on." The gallery stirred, surprised by the unexpected admission. Marcus studied Derek carefully, searching for sincerity in his words. There was no denying the man had been broken by the trial, but whether he could truly change was a question only time could answer. Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of his final judgment. "Officer Harris, your actions have caused harm that cannot be undone. While your apology is noted, it does not erase the pain you inflicted. This court sentences you to 5 years in prison, followed by mandatory community service upon release. You will also participate in programs focused on accountability and racial bias. Justice is not revenge, it is a chance to rebuild what you have broken." Derek nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he was led out of the courtroom. For the first time, he didn't resist the consequences. Whether it was regret, shame, or resignation that filled his heart, only he could say. After the sentencing, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and community members. Walter approached him, his steady presence grounding his son amid the whirlwind of attention. "You've done what needed to be done," Walter said quietly. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Marcus nodded. "I know, Dad. But today, we've taken a step forward." Walter placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. "And that step will lead to others." Clara Ramirez approached them, her notebook in hand. "Judge Green, what do you hope comes from this case?" Marcus considered her question before responding. "I hope it serves as a reminder. Accountability is not just about punishing individuals, it's about creating a system that values integrity over power. If this case inspires even one person to stand up against injustice, then it's worth it." The days that followed were filled with both celebration and reflection. Derek began serving his sentence, his days no longer defined by authority but by the harsh realities of life without it. He faced the consequences of his actions daily, grappling with the enormity of the damage he had caused. For him, prison became not just a punishment but a mirror, a place where he could no longer hide from the truth of who he had been. For Marcus, the case marked a turning point. He became a leading voice in pushing for systemic reform, working with community leaders and policymakers to address the deeper issues that had allowed Derek's behavior to go unchecked. His work was far from over, but he approached it with the same unwavering resolve that had carried him through the trial. Walter, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He became an advocate for programs that educated officers on racial bias and community relations, using his own experiences to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. His dignity, once tarnished by Derek's actions, now shone brighter than ever. The Green family grew closer through the ordeal, their bond strengthened by the shared fight for justice. Marcus's sister, Lisa, began organizing community events, creating spaces where dialogue and understanding could flourish. Together, they turned their pain into progress, ensuring that the lessons of their struggle would not be forgotten. As the story of Derek Harris and Marcus Green faded from the headlines, its impact remained. The city was changed, not fixed, not perfect, but moving in a direction where justice felt more attainable. Now, reflecting on the journey we've just taken together, let's ask ourselves, what does justice truly mean? Is it about punishment, or is it about accountability and the hope for change? This story isn't just about one man's fight for his father's dignity, it's about the battles we all face against systems that fail us, against silence, and against the fear of speaking out. Have you ever witnessed an injustice and wondered if you had the courage to stand against it? What would you do if someone you loved was wronged? These are the questions that Marcus Green's story asks us to confront. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of perseverance. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.